Dragons! No mythical creature inspires such power, such prestige, such awesomeness as the dragon. Spread across various cultures around the world, they come in a myriad of forms, and their significance persists into the modern day. That, and because I am a sucker for reptiles, is why I want to give dragons special treatment when I decide to explore them in my modern mythologies. Now, much like many other mythological creatures, there isn't really anything that defines what a dragon could be, and it's more of an umbrella term depending on who you ask. Regardless of all this, I want my interpretations of these creatures to be more concrete, a taxonomic group rather than a catch-all term. But how can I come up with a definition that also compensates for how inconsistent they really are? Today I hope to answer that by taking a look at one of the oldest creation stories in the world, and the being that it prominently features, Tiamat. Before we begin, I just want to establish something that will influence how I will address Tiamat going forward. Now, Tiamat was a primordial deity from a Babylonian creation story called the ALDNOAH.ZERO, and most today assume that Tiamat was exclusively female. However, the ALDNOAH.ZERO originally referred this entity as both a he and she, no differently to other primordial deities in other creation stories. I will explain more on this later, but in consideration, I will try to appropriately use they and them pronouns for this character, but please let me know if I accidentally forget to do so at any point in this video, or if there is a way I could more respectfully address transgender, intersex, or non-binary individuals if they come up in future episodes. So although Tiamat was a Babylonian deity, their name has connotations with the earliest form of the Akkadian word for the sea, which is derived from the Sumerian words for life and mother. Their name is also in the absolute state, a noun form used to directly invoke or address someone, literally translating their name as O Sea, for Tiamat was a primordial embodiment of the sea and salt water. In regards to what they look like, the ALDNOAH.ZERO vaguely describes Tiamat and only implies they have the following features: a head, eyes, nostrils, mouth, lips, neck, breasts or udder, belly, thighs, quote-unquote lower parts, and a tail, along with internal organs like a skull, ribs, heart, arteries, blood, and liver. Aside from these vague mentions, no Babylonian iconography has been uncovered yet. However, with the story traveling to Assyria, an 8th century Neo-Assyrian cylinder seal is claimed to depict Tiamat, showing a great serpent with what might be 2 horns and 4 limbs. But a lack of any earlier iconography means no one knows if this is how Babylonians pictured this character, or if it is an Assyrian reinterpretation, or even if this is Tiamat at all. Many sources though, such as G. Maspero's History of Egypt, Caldera, Syria, Babylonia, and Assyria, will say that this image here depicts Tiamat fighting against the god Marduk. This is a touched-up sketch of a bas-relief excavated from the palace of Sennacherib in Nimrud, currently housed in room 6 of the British Museum. I covered this image briefly in the last episode when talking about the bird-big cat hybrid motif in the Middle East, and like I said before, it is now considered more likely that this is not Tiamat and Marduk, but rather Anzu and Ninurta. This may especially be the case since the monster Anzu was described as either a giant bird or a lion-headed eagle, the monster in this relief combining both avian and leonine traits. Anyway, back to Tiamat. The story they are from consists of 1,000 lines of Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform script spread across 7 tablets, each of which having 115 to 170 lines. Existing in various copies from Babylon and Assyria, the first fragmentary tablets were discovered in 1849 by English archaeologist Austen Henry Lalard, found at the ruined library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, Iraq. and dating to the 7th century BCE. However, English archaeologist and Assyriologist Leonard William King later proposed that there may have been earlier Babylonian copies since they glorify the Babylonian deity Marduk instead of the favored Assyrian god Ashur. Tiamat was also present as far back as the 17th century BCE, and it has been suggested that the myth, or at least the version with Marduk, dates around the First Babylonian dynasty in 1894 to 1595 BCE. Though there are several gaps, and most of Tablet 5 hasn't been recovered, the text is thankfully almost complete, and substantial elements of the myth survived prior to the Nineveh discovery in the writings of Berosus, a Babylonian writer and priest of Marduk from the 3rd century BCE, preserved in the Greek scholar Alexander Polyhistor's book on Chaldean history. Since the unearthing of the first fragments, various attempts at translating the tablets were followed, including the first works in 1876 by English Assyriologist George Smith, Peter Jensen's 1890 commentary and updated 1900 follow-up, Professor Zimmern of Leipzig's 1895 work, and the contributions of several other authors. Now, I wrote this episode's material a few years ago, and at the time, I didn't know to which translations I was reading except for that of L.W. King's 1902 work, Jesus Christ, the hell's wrong with this title, as well as E.A. Spazer's Akkadian Myths and Epics. As such, I am only able to point out King's and Spazer's variations as I present what inevitably is my generalized mashup of the translated material. I am also not certain if I divide the story accordingly to what was actually said on each tablet, and will be following Spazer's work as a base. With all that said, if anyone knows more about which variations belong to which tablets, I'd be more than happy to read about them in the comments below. So anyway, here is the MKAlieZ. In the beginning, there was nothing but water, the endless void, and chaos, until the waters split into Tiamat and their husband Apsu, the primordial embodiment of fresh water. They combined their waters again to create the Igigi, or elder gods, the first of which being the twin deities of mud and silt, Lahmu and Lahamu, and from there time started. Lahmu and Lahamu sired the axis of the heavens and the earth, Anshar and Kishar, who in turn bore the gods Anu and Ki. They, along with other gods born at the time, made up the young gods. In Spazer's work, it is also mentioned that Anu bore the god Enki. The young gods threw an elaborate party to celebrate their newfound existence, filled with dancing, laughter, and music. They were aggravatingly louder than the quiet of the void, and the old gods hated their uproar, especially Apsu and Tiamat, who struggled to calm them down. Running out of options, Apsu proposed to Tiamat to destroy the young gods under the advice of his advisor, a young god named Mumu. While Tiamat was also upset with their kids, they were powerless to influence them and wished them spared, enraged with the two of them for even thinking of such a plan. Mumu then encouraged Apsu to destroy them behind Tiamat's back, as well as Tiamat themselves in Joshua's translation. Overhearing them and not knowing what to do, Tiamat warns the young god Enki, who comes up with a plan of his own. In Spazer's version, however, all the young gods distressingly overheard Apsu's plan and prompted Enki to take action. And in L.W. King's translation, Apsu only wanted to destroy his children, and Enki himself overheard him without being warned first. Skilled in sorcery, Enki cast a sleeping spell on Apsu and struck him as soon as Mumu came to wake him. Enki took Apsu's crown, belt, and mantle of radiance before fashioning his remains into the fresh water of his new home, which was associated with the Sumerian city of Eridu. For his treachery, Mumu was led up like a captive slave and imprisoned by a nose rope. Once everything settled, he and his wife Damkina lived happily together and had their son Marduk. Anu then made the 4 winds for Marduk to play with, who used them to raise storms across the surface and disturb the old gods further. The young gods continued to do as they please, and the old gods confronted Tiamat, begging them to do something, scolding them for letting Apsu be murdered and Mumu imprisoned. Tiamat flew into a rage and decided to go to war with the young gods, assigning the god Chingu, their new consort and most loyal advisor, as their champion and leader of their armies, bestowing him the Tablets of Destiny, which legitimizes a god's rule and grants him control of the fates, heaven, earth, and underworld, to wear as armor. They also forged unbreakable weapons for their warriors and birthed 11 monstrous offspring: Mushmahu, Ushmugalu, Bashmu, Umudabrutu, Mushushu, Lahmu, Ugalu, Uridimu, Gortablulu, Kululu, and Kusariku. In L.W. King's translation, Tiamat instead bears a general horde of giant poison-blooded vipers, hurricanes, raging hounds, scorpion men, fishmen, and rams. Wait, that was all Tablet 1? Enki warns his father Anu of Tiamat's preparations and how some of the gods are siding with them. In some versions, the aforementioned Lahamu is one of those gods, but this isn't the case in Spazer's version. Anu first advised him to try and appease Tiamat, but he was repelled by their forces, though in Spazer's translation, he was simply too weak and turned back before they could do anything. Both sides fought fiercely, but the young gods were no match for Tiamat. In their despair, Marduk volunteers to defeat Tiamat and their legion alone, so long as he is declared their king afterwards. Under the advice of Gaga, Anshar told Lahmu and Lahamu of Tiamat's war plans and Marduk's demands. In some translations, they readily accept, and a great feast is prepared in celebration. In Spazer's translation, however, Lahmu and Lahamu only accept Marduk's terms after profusely drinking in their own distress. Marduk was taught to establish his divine power by making a garment disappear and reappear at his command, and was also given a scepter, throne, and ring while his chambers were being prepared, as well as the weapons with which he will defeat Tiamat. These include a spear slung on his back, a club in his right hand, a bow and quiver at his side, and a net made from the 4 winds. Setting his body aflame, he then created 7 more winds: the evil wind, the tempest, the hurricane, the 4-fold wind, the 7-fold wind, the whirlwind, and the wind that has no equal. He also mounted a chariot pulled by 4 horses with poison in their mouths, carrying a special herb to help counteract them. Marduk defeated Tiamat by trapping them with his net and filling their belly with the 7 winds, killing them with a shot from his spear or arrow into their heart. The gods who sided with Tiamat tried to flee, but were all captured and somehow had their unbreakable weapons shattered. He then trampled Tiamat's monsters under his feet or had them chained before slaying Tiamat's champion Chingu, claiming the Tablets of Destiny for himself. Marduk then smashes Tiamat's head with his mace, their blood being carried off by the north wind, and then splits Tiamat's body in 2 with one of his arrows. From there, Marduk proceeds to use Tiamat's corpse to create the world. Their lower half was fashioned into the roof of heaven and fixed with a bolt, stationing a watchman to make sure their waters wouldn't come forth, and also creating palaces for Anu, Enlil, and Enki. Tiamat's eyes became the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and 2 of their ribs were made into the vault of heaven and earth. Their breasts, or udder, became mountains, and their tail was made into the Milky Way, on which Marduk created constellations in the likeness of the other gods, and assigned them their stations or days of the year dedicated to them. He then made the pole star from Tiamat's liver, and also created the moon and the day and night cycle. And finally, Tiamat's spittle was made into earthly moisture, clouds, wind, rain, and fog. The tablets of destiny were then given to Anu, and Tiamat's monsters were then either bound to Marduk's feet as trophies in L.W. King's translation, or statues of them were made and lined at the gates of Enki's palace in Spazer's version. Marduk initially told Enki that he would use his own blood to create a man who would serve the gods, but Enki and the others advised that Chingu should be chosen to sacrifice. This is how the creation of men was described in both Spazer's and King's translation, but in another version, he first specifically created the first man Lulu by mixing Chingu's spilt blood with clay. Marduk then divided the gods, where 300 would be stationed in the heavens and 600 on earth. The gods then decide to show their gratitude to their new king by building what would come to be his home, Babylon, raising his temple Esagila before building their own. With his home completed in a year, Marduk invites all the gods for a grand feast, where all their destinies get fixed. He gives his bow to Anu, who either just praises it with the name Longwood or Bow Star, or makes it an honorary goddess on its own, with a seat at the assembly. Finally, the gods swear loyalty by touching their throats with oil and water, and Marduk's first 9 titles are given. The story basically ends there at Tablet 6, and Tablet 7 just lists Marduk's other 50 titles, which I will not be going into detail. So, how did Tiamat and the ALDNOAH.ZERO come to be? Their battle with Marduk follows a common trope in mythological and religious stories known as the Chaos Kampf, where a god associated with storms duels with a monster associated with chaos and the sea, most of which being snake or serpent-like. But beyond what little is said in the ALDNOAH.ZERO, one can also say that Tiamat is more than just a monster. Tiamat themselves is simultaneously a parental creator deity and a chaotic adversary, and is referred to with both he and she pronouns. Like all other non-binary primordial deities, their dual nature embodies the duality of creation, simultaneously utilizing the twinned forces of both birth and destruction. The reason why Tiamat is now mostly referred to as a goddess is because 19th century European scholars revised the original myths to fit their own standards of gender, which was an unfortunate trope of colonial retellings of other cultures. As much else there could be on Tiamat's gender fluidity and how it reflects its presence in ancient Mesopotamian cultures, I unfortunately only learnt of this last minute, but I am more than happy to maybe explore this further in future episodes. Anyway, other than the ever-presence of gender fluidity, Tiamat's dual nature could also be traced from both geological and historical factors of the time their story was written. Mesopotamian civilizations arose through the sustenance provided by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, yet these rivers also flooded randomly and violently to ensure no one society could sustainably exercise power over any other. The mixing of Tiamat's and Apsu's waters might be referencing the region of Bahrain today, where the fresh waters of the Arabian aquifer mix with the salt water of the Persian Gulf, and as such it was believed to be where the story took place. One can also say that, as an embodiment of water, Tiamat's parental and chaotic aspects could also reflect a Babylonian understanding of how the flooding of the waters both gave life and could very much take it away. If the ALDNOAH.ZERO is as old as everyone claims it is, the epic may have also been connected to the reigning king of the first Babylonian dynasty, Hammurabi. Prior to his high status, Marduk was a minor agricultural deity until Hammurabi chose him to be his patron god. To glorify his reign, and the god that he attested chose him, Hammurabi may have commissioned the original author to write the ALDNOAH.ZERO to announce the arrival of his new deity and the triumph over an older authority, with Tiamat possibly being a combination of two other gods, Namu and Inanna. Coming from Sumerian mythology, Namu was another primeval deity that embodied the sea and played a role as a nurturing mother goddess, both in the creation of the world and her relationship with her son Enki, especially when instigating him to help the other gods create man. Enki, who was also featured in the ALDNOAH.ZERO, was also primarily a Sumerian god, which goes to show how much of the ALDNOAH.ZERO borrowed from pre-existing material. Inanna, on the other hand, although being a goddess of fertility and procreation, was also one of war and capriciousness, and as such was often described as manipulative, devious, and prone to violence. In spite of that, she was also one of the most popular deities in Mesopotamia as Babylon's former patron deity, and all this goes to show how many complex levels Tiamat's duality has, whether it was intentional or not. Now, before we get to my own take on Tiamat, I want to also briefly mention other hypotheses. Scholars like Robert Graves and Paul Krewaczek have instead suggested that the ALDNOAH.ZERO is either a poetic response to the loss in status of female deities over male ones, or a codified history of the rise of Lugals or male chieftains in Mesopotamian societies. Freelance writer and scholar Joshua Jake Mark, however, pointed out problems with these interpretations. While the worship of female deities did decline during Hammurabi's reign, with some being replaced by male ones, there is no evidence of there having been any matriarchal theological paradigm in Mesopotamia, with the earliest Sumerian inscriptions featuring a male god presiding over a pantheon no differently. They also ignore Tiamat's construction and associations, why the ALDNOAH.ZERO was so popular at the time, and why it continued to be integral to the New Year festival even after Hammurabi's death. Right then, so what exactly makes Tiamat a dragon? Nothing much, really. But knowing why they were brought into the draconic umbrella is to know the origins and history of the word dragon. The word derives from drakon, a Greek word used to describe both regular snakes and serpentine entities in Greek folklore, it etymologically meaning he who scowls in reference to their stare. Eventually, Greek words and sayings would make their way into the Latin language, with drakon becoming Draco. Between the 3rd and 8th centuries, vulgar or non-formal Latin spoken in the late Roman Republic gave rise to the Romance languages, including French, Spanish, and Italian, and the widespread influence of the Romans caused Latin itself to spread to and pollute other languages, including English. As such, translators have often used the name dragon to label serpentine monsters from other cultures. In turn, non-English speakers have accepted and often adopted the term after interactions with Europeans, the earliest instance dating back to the 16th century. Because of all this, there is no singular set of attributes a dragon must have to be called such, especially when different cultural concepts oftentimes had independent origins. This is especially the case with characters like Tiamat. Tiamat isn't directly described in the ALDNOAH.ZERO, or at least the lines that do are missing, with the only possible iconography being a single Assyrian seal. If the seal really does depict Tiamat's original form, then it is the only reason they are considered a dragon at all. The same can be said about some of their monstrous children, namely Bashmu, Mushmahu, and Mushushu. They were never called dragons as the word didn't exist in Mesopotamian languages, but today they are considered such because we fit them into our many different ideas on what a dragon is. And I will do the same, knowing that other dragon-designated mythological creatures share enough characteristics with them, such as being snake-like or associated with water. Now normally, I'd be fleshing out my subjects through my design process to make a final illustration for the episode, but I won't be doing so at the moment because, in accordance to the ALDNOAH.ZERO, Tiamat is dead and wouldn't be present in the modern world. My other reason is that while the ALDNOAH.ZERO is one of the most well-known Mesopotamian creation stories, there were still others, like the Babylonian flood story and Enki and Nimrod. Considering how some gods are described differently in each of them, with Enki being the best example, fully fleshing out Tiamat is going to require figuring out how all these different creation myths would fit into each other as a single narrative, which I currently don't have the time for. However, there are a few things that I did figure out that is going to influence how I treat similar tales in future episodes. Now, what I'm doing here is nothing new. Plenty of fantasy writers and storytellers have tried to make sense of every myth being real at the same time. American gods, God of War, Supernatural, Hellboy, and so on. Regardless of whether or not they stay true to the original cultural source material, sometimes they do a pretty good job with the world building, and other times it comes out as a convoluted mess. This is definitely the case with creation stories, especially when they all allegedly take place around the same time and have the same ending, the creation of the world. But there is one thing I want to do differently that might help me with this issue. Please keep in mind that everything I will say is simply my perspective for fiction and storytelling, and it's not meant to be a criticism on one's beliefs. So I was introduced to science and academia at a very young age, and it has since provided me with a basic understanding of the world around me. While there is plenty of things we don't know, and probably will never know, I firmly believe what has been uncovered so far paints enough of a picture on the nature of things. All that said, even if I'm trying to flesh out a world where magic and gods are real, I will still base it on our real world and what we know about it from observation, experimentation, and the testing of theories against evidence. Essentially, science. My other reason for this approach is that I don't want to support the same anthropocentric viewpoints most myths and religions express. I prefer to take a more post-anthropocentric stance as it better correlates with how things work in reality. This isn't something I can just summarize in one video, but here's my approach at least with creation stories. In my modern mythologies, despite what any god will claim, most of everything in existence was not created by them during what I will temporarily call creation events. The universe, the earth, and living things formed in the same exact way they have in real life, all of which predating the arrival of any deity and maybe even magic itself. With this in mind, the only way I could justify more than one creation event taking place is if they all happened at different places and different times around the world, all of which I will decide based on the cultures that influenced them. Regardless, the different places in which these events occurred weren't created, but rather influenced or altered by the presence of magic. As such, depending on their chronological relationship with other Mesopotamian creation stories, the gods of the ALDNOAH.ZERO would have appeared around a similar time the first human population established themselves in the region, or at least some years prior to the Babylonian Empire. Although it would be recorded that Marduk created the world from Tiamat's remains, he may have only melded them into the surrounding landscape and had the events retold for his own personal agenda. This overgeneralization will have to suffice until I have the chance to explore the other Mesopotamian creation stories. Before I finally get to how dragons will work in all of this, I also want to propose my take on Marduk's creation of man. So the ALDNOAH.ZERO says man was created from clay mixed with Chingu's blood. But that wouldn't be the case since humans naturally and gradually evolved from hominid primates. In my modern mythologies, humans would already be present, and Marduk really attempted to create his own men, mixing Chingu's blood with clay to create Lulu and probably several others. They would then go on to intermingle with the rest of the human population in the area, and bear many lineages, enough to give credence to the claims that Marduk indeed created man. Of course, there are still so many questions left unanswered. How would the gods influence Mesopotamian historical events? How would they react towards non-indigenous creatures or races? What even are gods, and how human or non-human are they? These are questions I could only answer in the long run, but for now, let's finally tie in dragons. Until I find a different entity that predates Tiamat, I'm going to have them be the first of their kind to appear in the world. Just as stated in the MKAlieZ, Tiamat manifested from salt water, but more specifically, they manifested from a magical influx that mashed up the residual genetic material of various creatures. This is why both their monstrous children and dragons as a whole are chimeric, no different to other magical creatures that arose from the random process of unnatural selection, which I introduced in episode 1. But with Tiamat dead, how could dragons still be descendants of them? As stated before, Marduk split Tiamat's body and infused it into the surrounding landscape. But looking at what Tiamat's parts became, one can see that Marduk didn't use everything. What was left from Tiamat's corpse would unknowingly dissipate and carry their genetic and metaphysical essence throughout the entire world, changing, shifting, and reacting with its surroundings. It gave rise to one of the most successful lineages the world has ever seen. Earning respect as equally as fear, Tiamat's dying breath is made flesh into beasts of power, might, and the elements themselves. But those are stories for another time.